Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at the situation in Afghanistan, especially the recent spike in terrorist activities, both within Afghanistan and across the border as well. Something that Pakistan has been talking about since the Taliban regime came into power in Afghanistan. We also understand that what has been happening in Afghanistan is also putting question marks on the capability and also the sincerity of the government in power. We also know that there have been a recent spike in attacks in Afghanistan by the ISSK as well and other terrorist groups as well. And this recent spike in attacks have also put into light whether or not the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan will be able to fulfill their responsibility towards their own citizens and as well as protect their soul being used against any other territory, especially Pakistan as well. With regards to the TTP, Pakistan has repeatedly called out to the Afghan Taliban and spoken to them with reference to who is going to be responsible for what has been going on and how the Afghan Taliban can facilitate what is happening in Pakistan and in other parts of Afghanistan as well in terms of ending that violence and also facilitating dialogue, and whether or not we can also see for support in terms of cross-border management. We also saw that there has been statements from Pakistan outrightly calling for a serious support from the Afghan Taliban are facing consequences, and also talking about cross-border management in terms of shifting away the terrorist groups away from the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. This is going to be the focus of our discussion today, where we'll be taking a look at what is going on within Afghanistan and the Taliban regime capability and responsibility towards what is going on within the country and elsewhere as well. For this and more, I have been joined in the studios by Farrukh Pitafi and Faisal, as always, and we've also been joined online by Mr. Asif Durrani, who's a former ambassador, and Mr. Tariq Farhadi, who's an Afghan affairs expert. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us in the show today. I'll start with you, Mr. Asif Durrani. When we look at the situation in Afghanistan in terms of the recent spike in terrorist activities, this is, of course, a cause of concern for Pakistan, also in terms of cross-border activity and something that we have been talking about in the past as well. But even within Afghanistan, this poses serious challenges to the Taliban regime as well. And this means also that a lot is also being talked about in terms of whether or not the Afghan Taliban are capable and secondly sincere in terms of dealing with these terrorist groups. In the way that the recent situation has evolved and the statements have come out from the Taliban regime, do you think that perhaps these questions that are being raised are valid against the Taliban regime in power in Afghanistan?
Sana, I think there are many paradoxes as far as Pakistan's relations with the Taliban regime is concerned. Foremost being that the PTP, which is a terrorist organization, has been conducting its activities inside Pakistan while using Afghanistan as a sanctuary. They are, in fact, having a field day inside Afghanistan. The sanctuaries are safe. No action has been taken by the Taliban regime. One reason, the paradox I want to point is that ideologically they are cousins to each other. The TTP owes allegiance to Mullah Habibullah Khan, and I think if that is correct, then in that respect, their allegiance or their bayat on Mullah Khan bounds the letter to give protection to the TTP people. So if in that case, I think it would be very difficult for the Taliban regime to take any action against the TTP. They can only restrict them not to launch attacks inside Pakistan. Otherwise, taking harsh action against the TTP would be beyond the call of duty of the Taliban because of TTP's allegiance to Mullah Khan. And then for Pakistan, the difficulty is that it has all along been supporting the Taliban as far as the political solution was concerned. But now the problem is that the regime, which was supposed to bring stability in the country. It has succeeded to an extent, but not completely. And now there are news that the kind of suicide attacks which the ISIS Khorasan is conducting in various parts of Afghanistan shows that the sleeping cells of the ISIS and those groups which were anti-Taliban, they are also getting active. So I think coming weeks and months are going to be very difficult.
Right,
Yes.
and we'll talk more about that as well in terms of what the Afghan Taliban can do against the TTP and other groups and what Pakistan needs to do in this regard. Mr. Farhadi, when we look at the situation, not just with reference to TTP, but the ISSK as well and other terrorist groups within Afghanistan as well, do you think that the way that the Taliban regime has been responding is helping their case in terms of international recognition or going against it? Is this distinction that is being created in terms of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys helping the Afghan Taliban regime in terms of calling out or bringing attention to the international community of how they need to be able to fight those terrorist groups? Or is this actually being counterproductive in terms of the international community looking at the situation as everyone being in the same?
Greetings to you. First things first, let me condemn the aerial attacks of Pakistan a week or 10 days back inside Afghanistan. This puts at risk the territorial integrity of Afghanistan, and people died. So these people could have been TTP, but human beings died. So we have to register that on this show because people are watching us in Afghanistan as well, and they expect us to have this conversation here. Who is TTP? TTP have come to Afghanistan from Pakistan. So it's a Pakistan problem exported into Afghanistan. Pakistan was very close to the Taliban. So I think this should be resolved through talks rather than increasing tensions between Pakistan and the people of Afghanistan. And the people of Afghanistan are different from the Taliban. And when Pakistani jets overfly Kunar or Sarkano, and it's being in process now, this creates bad feelings for all the 40 million people of Afghanistan, whereas the problem is that the Taliban are not fast enough to tell off their friends from attacking Pakistan, the TTP. So we don't want to get into a fight with Pakistan over TTP. Because if we won the fight, we would give something to TTP. No, that's not the case. The people of Afghanistan are not with the TTP. They are not with the Taliban either. We are unfortunate that the Taliban have taken power in Afghanistan, but Pakistan knew about this. But we have to fix it together.
Isn't it right that TTP is not the only entity which is target of Pakistan army right now, but ISIS Khorasan as well? And we need to understand one thing, that ISIS Khorasan is not only targeting Pakistan, but it is targeting Afghanistan as well. It is targeting the poor people of Afghanistan who need help of the world right now. And we know that in recent times there were attacks of ISIS Khorasan within Kabul, within Kandahar, on different schools and colleges. Isn't it right that Pakistan is doing against them whatever it is doing? And shouldn't the Taliban be standing with Pakistan when Pakistan does it?
Pakistan planes getting into the airspace of Afghanistan is not right. No. Under international laws, and I as an Afghan condemn it. Yes, ISIS Khorasan has attacked our Shiite community in a very savage way, our Hazara community, and in Kunduz they just attacked a Sufi mosque. So these are extremists. These are people that we should, with collaboration and diplomacy and intelligence collaboration, we should get rid of. But the first thing is that Pakistan should use its influence, its organic influence and historic influence over the new Taliban government to fix this through talks. I understand talks are ongoing right now, I feel that in Pakistan, there are three actions going on. There is the intelligence services that are doing talks. There's the army that is flying the jets and dropping the bombs, which is condemnable. And there is the government, which has inherited a very difficult file, which might create questions with the international community for it if it gets to come to a violent point. The new government of Pakistan would rather not have this problem because the UNICEF, which is part of the United Nations, now has said that children have died as a result of the last attack by Pakistani jets. So it's better to cool off the situation, to let the intelligence services of Pakistan lead the discussions with the Taliban and take the TTP people further away from the border. That would be the first step of solving this problem. ISIS, Khorasan, and TTP will not go away with bombs.
To understand the role that the Afghan Taliban can play in this regard, earlier I asked Mr. Asif whether or not he thinks that the Taliban regime currently in power in Afghanistan is actually capable or sincere in its efforts towards dealing with the ISIS-K and other terrorist groups. If we just talk about what has happened within Afghanistan as well and against the Hazara communities you were talking about and other parts of Afghanistan, do you think that the response that just the Afghan Taliban regime has given within its own country it signifies the kind of potential that they have in protecting their own citizens, or there needs to be more on that front?
Yeah, I think Taliban are capable of tackling the ISIS-K, and their ISIS-K number is not that big. But yes, their nuisance value because of the tactics they use, the suicide tactics they use. It creates scare, it creates terror, and of course, it attracts international media attention. So that is the case. But to think that ISIS-K perhaps would be able to create a kind of its own government or pockets inside Afghanistan, I don't think so. They did try in Kunar, in Nangarhar, but they failed. I think they were softened whatever areas of influence they tried to create. So they will be a nuisance. They are a nuisance, but they are not a formidable threat. Yes.
Mr. Azhar, when we look at Pakistan's strategy and the measures that it has been taking and been trying to fight against the terrorist groups within Pakistan as well, and then of course be able to manage the border better as well, in terms of the way that we have seen different strategies being employed, what more do you think still needs to be done, and how are we to approach the subject? Because again, like in the past, we have spoken to the Afghan Taliban regime and asked for their support as well, but perhaps the kind of facilitation that is required or expected from Pakistan is not being met.
I think diplomacy is the right channel and right way of tackling issues like TTP's attacks inside Pakistan while using Afghan territory. And as Mr. Farhadi has talked about the aerial attack from the Pakistan side, I tend to agree with him. I think it was a harsh response. But I think, and that calls for immediate negotiations by both sides to avoid future incidents like that. But at the same time, I think Afghan regime will also have to take remedial measures. And they have to, in fact, counsel TTP not to misuse Afghan territory to launch attacks. They are inside Pakistan and they do some actions that is besides the point, and no one blames the Afghan government about that. But if they are attacking border posts, then they are using the Afghan territory. So here we have to make a distinction. And then if they go back and they go back scot-free, so they get encouraged. And that also creates suspicions inside Pakistan in the official circles whether they are being, sheltered by the regime, by the government. So there's a need to have serious negotiations. There has to be some roadmap with regard to the activities of TTP. The dialogue was brokered by the Taliban regime, but it failed. So it means either the Taliban could not counsel the TTP, or perhaps they didn't want to, perhaps, because ideologically they are the same. And then
Yes, Mr. Asif, when we look at the conflict or any issues around the world, I understand how it all boils down to negotiation, political dialogue, perhaps. But Farrukh, when we look at this particular situation and the kind of threats that we're facing, or the kind of terrorist groups that are involved in this negotiation, do you think that perhaps this is an exceptional case in which we cannot proceed in terms of the negotiations or dialogue as is being called out for, and needs perhaps strategies that complement that as well?
Right, Sana, my cardiologist has asked me not to take too much stress, and I've been trying to hold my peace just to make sure that I don't get excited. But honestly, to answer your question, I must say it, I don't know. You know why? I have been highlighting all these issues for quite some time. Exactly. For example, when it comes to Afghan Taliban, their takeover, I was warning that if that happens, this is exactly what will happen, and that is happening. Because they are ideologically, all these far-right religious extremist groups are simpatico.
Yeah.
They are never going to turn on each other unless they consider them, cultural or religious other. Perhaps Sunnis can attack Shias, Shias can attack Sunnis, but I don't think that these groups actually want to go against each other, right? That is one aspect which is very important to comprehend. Then the issue of TTP. I have been warning that every time you have tried to compromise with them a bit, they have always territorially made incursions, they have killed innocents, and then they start fighting again. And that has been happening again as well. Once again, let me also remind you that when actually Farhadi Sahab actually brought up the issue of territorial integrity of Afghanistan, I was hoping that Faisal here, Ambassador Sahab, is going to contradict that, because usually in every such episode there is a plausible deniability that you can always say that we don't have any proof because Pakistan has not actually admitted these attacks, but that didn't happen. So let me very clearly remind everybody that I have been repeatedly saying that Afghanistan is an independent country, and we'll have to treat its territorial sovereignty exactly like we want ours to be treated. So my humble submission is, honestly, I don't want to see good Taliban, bad Taliban, good religious scholar, bad religious scholar. When ISIS-K actually attacks, it also kills girl children. I'm father of 2 girls, right? When TTP actually, when Taliban come to power, they also try to exclude girls from schools. When TTP takes over in certain parts of this country, they did. In Swat, we saw they attacked Malala, and she barely made it, right? So my problem is that if you are consistently part of the problem, I don't want to have anything to do with it.
Right, and that of course puts into question whether or not negotiation with such groups is going to be productive or not. Mr. Farhadi, I know you've called out for negotiation, for talks, and it seems to be the only option in a way. But then again, for them to be fruitful, we'll need a lot more than just to sit on the table. Can we expect that either from the TTP or the ISIS-K or even the Afghan Taliban regime?
So yes, as it was discussed here, basically, when if Pakistan attacks the soil of Afghanistan, all of the people of Afghanistan get hurt. You see, feelings, and but this is just a TTP Taliban problem. So we don't want to create these ill feelings between the people of Afghanistan and the people of Pakistan. We have to explain. It hasn't been explained inside Afghanistan. People are all worked up about this, you see, and perhaps inside Pakistan as well. But we have to explain that this is a group called TTP, another group called Taliban. They were together, they were friends, and one of them now has power in Afghanistan, which is Taliban, and they have been very slow to convince their TTP friends to not to create problems for Afghanistan. It is the Taliban's responsibility to rein in the TTP because they should not attack Pakistan from the soil of Afghanistan. That's true. But we should avoid the military solution, and we should go and see what leverage Pakistan has over the Taliban. I am sure Pakistan has leverage over the Taliban, those who are in power in Kabul. Their families are in Pakistan, you see. So this leverage should be used. I'm sure it's being discussed within the intelligence services of Pakistan. I know that meetings are going on right now. It's better to give a chance to those meetings to put pressure on Taliban. We also need pressure being put on Taliban. We also suffer from the fact that Taliban have closed girls' schools, dear Farrukh has said. Anybody who has leverage on Taliban, and we know Pakistan does, should put pressure on Taliban, really. And for now, I think to convince the Taliban to move away the TTP further in Afghanistan, but at some point we have to negotiate. Pakistanis have to negotiate with TTP on creating a peaceful solution. We know from the 20 years of war with the Americans that bombs don't solve the terrorism problem. Talks do, very complicated talks with on and off, as there were talks in November with TTP and the government of Pakistan, and there was a one-month truce, and it didn't work, and unfortunately it didn't work. These are extremist groups. They want everything, but I think there are other ways to tackle them than to put two countries at war.
Talking about the extremist groups, TTP is not the only extremist group which is being facilitated within Afghanistan. Of course, there are many others as well. One of them recently, it's called Jaish-e-Adl. It captured 21 of the soldiers of Iran in Sistan province. Number one. Number two, there are several others. IMU is one of them, and of course, other countries, the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, they have concerns over it. ETIM. And of course, if we talk about ETIM, China has concerns over it. TTP, ISIS Khorasan is a challenge for Taliban themselves. And we know that when Qatar Accord took place, Taliban were expected to save other countries from all of these terrorist outfits, and if there was something which was needed to be done against them, rest of the countries, they were expecting them to do it. And now, of course, things are out of their control for several reasons. One of them reason is, of course, there is a humanitarian crisis going on within Afghanistan, and they need to look after that as well. Shouldn't it be coming from all of the neighboring countries? And shouldn't they be joining hands with Pakistan to talk to Taliban to control all of these, outfits? Or it should only be Pakistan talking to Afghanistan?
So the most leverage is with Pakistan, with Taliban. When we talk about Taliban and where they stayed in the last 20 years, where their families are, the most leverage is with Pakistan. Of course, the other countries are doing, but the countries' interests are different. It's very difficult to bring coordination. And at some times, Afghanistan's neighbors are even competing with each other, you see. There are problems, border problems between Iran and Pakistan as well in Balochistan. So it's very hard we have an expression in Pashto language that to put several cats on a scale in order to weigh them, or some of them move away, you see. So it's better because we are with Pakistan. Pakistan has leverage over the Taliban. It has to use this leverage secretly, openly, but the Taliban are too slow to rein in the terrorists. That's our
Very quickly, I just have to actually take exception to the metaphor that you use, an analogy. Being a cat daddy, I can tell you that it is not even easy to weigh one cat on a scale, but to talk about all of them together.
But if we talk about Pakistan's leverage with the Taliban, Pakistan might have leverage with the Taliban, but at that time, of course, they were not a government. Now they are a regime within Afghanistan. So shouldn't the rest of the countries, coming forward and joining hands with Pakistan to talk with the Taliban regime, sir?
Ambassador Saab, perhaps you can take this question.
Yeah, I think the efforts are on, of course, not publicly. So immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, they are meeting, they are discussing, and they have already reached a consensus that they will recognize the Taliban regime simultaneously. When, I cannot say it, but I think they will take a collective decision. And at the same time, when you are talking about Afghanistan, it is still not a stable country. Let's face the facts. And Taliban are, if to go by their number, they cannot, with their number, control the whole of the country. That is also a fact. And then if they think that they can fight all the fronts, they'll stretch too thin, and I think they won't be able to succeed. And then when you talk about other ethnic and religious minorities, they are not satisfied yet. So Taliban will have to satisfy them as well. Then they have ISIS-K, which is a headache, which is a nuisance. So they have to tackle that as well. So there's a long list of problems which Taliban will have to tackle. Forget about the humanitarian crisis which the country is facing. And the humanitarian crisis will create a vicious cycle inside Afghanistan, which would be disastrous, not only for Afghanistan, because 95% of the country is now below the poverty line. And it would be disastrous not only for Afghanistan, but for the immediate neighborhood, especially Pakistan. And then it will not stop here. It will end up in Europe. And then there are now estimates that perhaps the number of Syrian refugees would be rather, far less than what the Afghan refugees are going to make a line to Europe. So I think...
Mr. Farhadi, earlier we were talking about how perhaps all of these groups, including the Taliban regime in power, are ideologically connected. I want to understand whether or not the Taliban regime being in power now and these ideological connections existing actually should have helped in terms of reining in these terrorist groups and being able to get them on the same page in terms of dealing with issues both within Afghanistan and outside. And if that's not the case, if these groups, so to speak, will not go against each other in that manner and will allow them in whatever activities they want to engage in, then doesn't this also take away from the hopes that the Afghan Taliban regime has in terms of international recognition and being able to run the country as a proper government?
Well, when you talk about the ideological plane, then it is not a cost.
Ambassador Saab, let's hear Mr. Farhadi on this.
Has a better answer, I'm sure, with his experience. Here, I would say,
don't worry,
because of poverty, criminality might take over, actually. These are small groups. Taliban is 80,000, ISIS is 2,000, TTP, I don't know the exact number. But if poverty is exacerbated in Afghanistan, let's not forget that we are the biggest exporter of opium as well. There are other criminal groups that are behind this and in action in Afghanistan, which would love chaos in Afghanistan. And anybody with $5 or $10 million could hire a private army in Afghanistan once poverty gets acute. The Iranians have complained that in the last 8 months, 1 million people have migrated to Iran. And they are very worried that among the 4,000 people who crossed the border from Nimroz to Iran, Daesh also might cross the border into Iran, and that's their clear enemy. So in Afghanistan, really, my request here from Pakistan is to use the leverage and rein in the Taliban, because they have the keys to the power and they have the keys to the solutions that we're talking about.
And I understand that, but again, at the end of the day, a lot of that also needs to come from the Afghan Taliban as well. Even if the leverage is used, there needs to be a lot of action that needs to be taken, which perhaps we haven't really seen so far in terms of the international commitments made earlier as well. Ambassador Saab, when we look at what has been going on within Afghanistan, if we don't just focus on the TTP, but then other terrorist groups within Afghanistan as well, even though there might be this lack of action from the Taliban regime against them, this of course creates lots of problems for the regime in terms of being looked at as a responsible and capable government, because of course they're not able to perhaps provide the kind of security that they were talking about previously and what they were fighting for.
Yes, your question carries the answer. So it was easy for the Taliban while they were in opposition and they were fighting the governments. They had no responsibility. But now that they are in Kabul, they are in power. So they have to, in fact, fulfill all the responsibilities, to which they are not coming up to the mark. They are failing on many fronts. So this should be a source of concern for us. And we can only, in fact, counsel the regime there. We cannot, do their job. That job is to be done by the Afghan Taliban themselves. And this is a problem. For instance, we here, as far as TTP is concerned, we have been unable to tackle the TTP or wipe them out successfully. So the reason is that it's a terrorist organization. They choose the time and venue, and we are lucky if we get hold of them in time. So same dilemma is faced by the Afghan Taliban also, that with various terrorist groups, whether it is ETIM or it is TTP or Uzbek.
Right.
IMU.
Right, and Mr. Farhadi, when we look at the ceremony recently as well by military officials in Afghanistan honoring suicide bombers earlier as well, and then considering what has been going on with the ISIS-K and other terrorist groups within the country and the lack of the Taliban regime in dealing with them, does this not also hinder in terms of taking away the former tag of a terrorist group or as terrorists on the Taliban regime in power, and perhaps is contradictory to their aspirations of being recognized? Again, all of the other issues such as inclusivity and rights of women and access to education is still not being looked after. And then we understand that there are different communities that are also being targeted, and the Taliban regime being in power still is not able to do much about it. So how do we see perhaps the issue of recognition evolving in the recent weeks or months? Because it seems that they're going further away from that.
Are you asking me?
Mr. Farhadi, can you hear me?
Yes. I can tell you, we just had our iftar in Geneva, Switzerland. So sorry if I showed some dates and drinks here. But we have gratefulness that we can discuss with you all these complicated things. I'm grateful that I'm invited here. Taliban really, I'm not sure now they are concerned about their image. They have done all the worst things. With closing of the girls' schools, with the fact that they don't have any timelines. For the first few months, there was a little bit of optimism. But one thing that I could imagine is that the Prime Minister of Pakistan is traveling to Saudi Arabia this week, I believe. Maybe Saudi Arabia can play a role, although This time they are not very close to the Taliban, but last time around in 1996 they had recognized them officially. Saudi Arabia has changed a lot with the new prince MBS, but Saudi Arabia is still responsible to come in and give advice. The OIC is there. We have had these discussions. Maybe more help is needed from OIC and Saudi Arabia in convincing the Taliban to first not become a problem for neighbors of Afghanistan. Second, improve their governance and open the girls' schools. Third, make the government inclusive. They are not worried. The Taliban are not worried about the humanitarian crisis. They say, look, this is the responsibility of the international community. They don't take their responsibility at heart, the Taliban. They have left the poverty and hunger in Afghanistan up to the international community, and the international community can address it in a partial way, I must say. And with what's going on in Ukraine, nobody has attention and money for Afghanistan any longer. This is very sad.
Fahadi Saab, recently, I think a couple of months ago, Director General of MI5, Ken McCallum, he was of the view that he has intelligence that ISIS Khorasan, it is employing people from within Afghanistan to join ISIS Khorasan, and of course they are handing out from $280 per month to $400 per month, which is a very good amount within Afghanistan. But my concern is who is funding ISIS Khorasan right now, and shouldn't the Taliban regime within Afghanistan be more cautious and more worried about ISIS Khorasan right now, sir?
They should be cautious about any group, irrespective of whether it is ISIS Khorasan or it is IUM or it is TTP, because those groups those are armed groups. So it means their main bread and butter is their gun, and they are hired guns. They can be used anywhere. So we should understand this, very clearly. ISIS Khorasan, it's faceless. So an entity which is faceless will only create terror. Taliban were not faceless. They had their spokespersons, they had their office in Doha, they were negotiating with the people while they were fighting. So this was a difference between a faceless terrorist group and a known resistance group. So here I think we should make a distinction, because sometimes people call the Afghan Taliban as terrorists. Had they been terrorists, so they would not have been maintaining a Doha office and with the approval of the international community, especially the Americans. And Americans were negotiating with them since 2011, I know for sure. And 2013, they in fact opened the office in Doha. So here we have to see from that point of view. The problem is there, it has to be tackled, but here it also depends on the capability of the Taliban, how they tackle it politically, how they tackle it ideologically. Because I have my doubts about even Taliban's ideology, that whether they are ideologically capable enough to counter their brothers in arms. And I have yet to see a Talib who is a scholar par excellence. So I think here there are many questions than answers. So that's why I said there are many paradoxes here when you are talking about...
Sir, very recently we know that ISIS Khorasan was obviously conducting its activities within Pakistan as well. Either they were conducting themselves or they were catering TTP. So should we consider somebody of our foes behind them, funding them? And we already know that, of course, our eastern neighbor, it had a lot to do in Pakistan whenever it comes to terrorism. And of course TTP and BLA, BLF, they have been invested by our eastern neighbor India.
Look, if there is a problem, then investors would be very much there. Saboteurs would be there. So I will not be surprised even if ISIS Khorasan is being financed by the Indians. because they would want the second front open for Pakistan in any way. And they are, yes, they have been funding TTP. I would not be surprised that if the TTP is still receiving those funds in order to sustain themselves. Because if that is the case, if 95% of Afghanistan is suffering from poverty and TTP people are thriving, so it means that their tummies are full. So they are getting enough calories and they are getting enough dollars or money or Afghanis to sustain themselves. And then
my last question to Mr. Farhadi would be, when you talk about how earlier you said perhaps that the Taliban regime does not care about its image anymore or the humanitarian crisis as well and has left that onus on the international community, do you think that this actually pushes the international community more in terms of doing something about it, or diffuses them of their responsibility to help the people?
The international community really is busy with Ukraine, you see. The international community, the people who decide on the budgets are sitting in Brussels and Washington, D.C. All their time is consumed now by Ukraine, where there has been 5.2 million refugees, 13 million people displaced, and Mr. Zelensky is asking for $7 billion a month in financial support. $7 billion a month. So the international community wants to forget about our region. That's the truth. So this becomes really a problem that we have to find.
Are you telling us, sorry to cut you, Farhadi sir, but are you telling us that the international community is one-trick pony? It cannot,
Right.
focus on two things simultaneously, sir? Humanitarian, loss is humanitarian loss everywhere. Afghanistan, they can't see that only less than a year ago, Afghanistan was a country with an elected, even nominally, an elected government, a parliament, institutions, and God knows how much nuances, and now it doesn't.
You know, they have really given up on that investment. They have given up on Afghanistan. The international community has given up on this region. We have to start back from zero to get the attention, get the funding, at least get the recognition to get the World Bank and IMF programs for Afghanistan. But really the whole region, as I see it, is suffering from a lack of engagement of the international community. And with Ukraine, they have something in their backyard that is drawing really all the financial blood of Western countries. Ukraine is for now, that's it is. Maybe 6 months later it will change. They will have more wavelength and attention for South Asia.
Right, let's see what happens. Thank you so much, Mr. Tariq Farhadi, for joining us, and Mr. Asif Durrani for being a part of the show as well. What, of course, eventually happens in Afghanistan and elsewhere, we really hope that the suffering of the people is alleviated, and calls for international community's help and attention of the world is there sooner rather than later. And that is all that we can really hope for, but it remains to be seen what actually happens. We'll see on the debate tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching.